In the fall of 2019, I landed a remote job that required me to stay in a small town for a month-long project. The company provided accommodations in an old Victorian home that had been converted into a bed and breakfast. It wasn't the kind of place I'd normally choose to stay to, old, too creaky, and way too much history for my taste, but it was free, so I didn't complain. The house stood on the edge of town, partially hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusty wrought iron gate. Its once bright white paint had faded to a dull gray, and the windows seemed perpetually foggy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When I arrived, the owner, a frail older woman named Mrs. Beckett, greeted me at the door with the key and a kind but distant smile. "Room 6, she said, handing me the key. "Top of the stairs, at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7 sharp. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like walking into a room where an argument had just taken place. The wooden floors groaned beneath my feet, and the faint scent of lavender and something metallic lingered in the air. Room 6 was small but clean. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern, and an antique rocking chair sat in one corner, facing the window. A large, 4-poster bed dominated the room, its wooden frame polished to a dull shine. Despite the cozy decor, the atmosphere was off. It felt like someone was watching me, though I knew I was alone. I shook off the feeling and unpacked my things, chalking it up to the age of the house and my own nerves. That night, I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, the dim glow of the screen, the only light in the room. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the old window frame, but then I realized it was more distinct, like words, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. "Hello?" I called out, sitting up in bed. The whispering stopped immediately, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding, but nothing moved. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been my imagination and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next day, I asked Mrs. Beckett if there were any other guests staying in the house. She shook her head. "Not this week," she said. "It's just you." That answer didn't sit well with me, but I tried to ignore it. I spent most of the day working in town and didn't return to the house until late that evening. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I noticed something strange. The door to room 6 was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. Pushing the door open, I was hit with an icy draft, as if the room had been left open to the elements. The rocking chair in the corner was slowly moving back and forth, the creak of the wood loud in the stillness. My stomach twisted, but I stepped inside, determined to prove to myself that it was just an old house with drafts and creaky furniture. I closed the window which had been left open a crack and locked it, telling myself that Mrs. Beckett had probably been in the room to clean. Still, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent, and definitely coming from within the room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, rising and falling in rhythm, but the words were impossible to decipher. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The voices stopped, replaced by the sound of the rocking chair creaking. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner. The chair was moving again, swaying back and forth on its own. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the chair. The beam of light illuminated the empty seat, but the chair kept moving, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. That was it. I bolted out of the room, not caring that I was barefoot and wearing pajamas. I ran down the stairs and pounded on Mrs. Beckett's door until she answered, her expression a mix of concern and annoyance. "There's something in my room," I blurted out, her face paled. "Room 6? She asked softly. I nodded, and she sighed, her shoulders sagging. She led me into her sitting room, where she motioned for me to sit. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began, "but since you've experienced it, you deserve to know." Mrs. Beckett told me that the house had a long history of strange occurrences, most of which seemed to center around room 6. Decades ago, before the house was a bed and breakfast, it had been a boarding house, A man named Arthur Whitlow had stayed in room 6 for several months, a quiet, reclusive man who rarely spoke to the other boarders. One night, he was found dead in the rocking chair, an empty bottle of pills at his feet. Some say he took his own life, Mrs. Beckett said. Others say it wasn't natural, but ever since then, guests in room 6 have reported things. I stared at her, my skin crawling. Why keep renting it out if you know it's haunted? She gave me a weak smile. Not everyone believes in ghosts, and for those who don't, it's just a room. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed in the sitting room until the sun came up, clutching my bag and watching the shadows shift across the walls. The next morning, I checked out early and drove straight to the nearest hotel, paying out of pocket for the rest of my stay. I never went back to that house, and I've avoided Victorian-era buildings ever since. To this day, I can't explain what happened in room 6, but I'll never forget the sound of those whispers or the sight of that empty rocking chair, swaying back and forth like it had a mind of its own.